Well, good morning. My name is Chad Shookman. I'm the Director of Youth Ministries here at the Water's Edge, and we're so glad that you could join us this Memorial Day weekend. Over the past few weeks, we've been in this series called Any Given Sunday, and we've been looking at the practices of the church. We've been looking at the different traditions that we have and what they mean and what they represent and how those fold into who we are. Some church traditions would call these sacraments, and even if they aren't considered sacraments in the Methodist Church, we'll have that for another sermon somewhere else down the line. These practices, they hold truths. They hold truths that are generally shared by all churches. They're truths which help us to better understand and grow in our faith. And along the way, we've also celebrated some really, really cool things, right? The very first Sunday of this series was confirmation. In our first week, we saw 32 students stand in front of the church as they confirmed their faith. And in doing so, they made this public profession of faith. And through that, our congregation welcomed them. We let them know that you are welcome in the church, and we accepted them into membership here at the Water's Edge. Through confirmation, we learned that we are welcomed. The second week was holy orders. And a lot of times when we talk about holy orders in an older and in a traditional sense, like the Catholic Church has seen this as a call towards priesthood or as a call towards monastic life to become a monk or a nun and to live a life separated and celibate and in service completely to God. But the reality is, as we looked at that, we learned for us that we are all commissioned. Right? We recognize the accomplishments and the future plans of our graduating seniors. And in learning about our commissioning, what Craig shared with our students and what we can all learn from that is that we are all called, in whatever path we take, to follow and to live out our lives of faith, to be who God has called us to be. The third week, on Mother's Day, we celebrated the people who pour into our lives. And in the process of that, we looked at and we remembered that nobody is perfect. We were reminded that all of us, we carry some little secrets or some hurts and some burdens. All of us, to some extent, we find throughout life that there's points where we realize we're a little bit broken, or maybe a lot. But we discovered that in the midst of that brokenness and the hurt and the pain that we have, that we can also discover hope and healing. And that even though the world isn't perfect and neither are its people, that we can find solace and acceptance in the church because Jesus provides that for us. Last week, Pastor Craig talked about baptism and communion. And we got to experience a baptism. We got to experience baptisms. I think we've had a baptism every week of this series as well. But what we learned and what we understood is that in grace, or is that in baptism and in communion, those are opportunities in which we experience God's grace. Right? In baptism, grace is something that we receive. It's given to us. And in communion, we experience grace when we give things away, when we let go of our hurts, when we let go of our burdens, and when we confess and let go of our sins. And in doing so, our load, it gets lighter, and our experience of God's grace continues to grow. So through baptism and communion, we discover that we are loved, that we are forgiven, and that we are included, and that we are fed. Well, today, I want to talk about marriage. In the Catholic Church, marriage is a sacrament. And I kind of want to talk about marriage, but I kind of don't want to talk about marriage. You see, I don't think that I'm probably the most qualified person in the world to talk about marriage, at least not in the sense of how you should all have a good marriage. There are a lot of people that I would consider so much better at this conversation than I am. If it was about, if the topic was really for you about what your marriage was like, one, I'd find that I'm probably not speaking to about half the people in this congregation, right? Some of you are too young. Some of you have been through, have never been married. Some of you have experienced divorce. And so maybe that's not the best actual conversation to have. If I was going to have it, it wouldn't be me. It'd be my grandfather, and he'd get to tell you about how for 60 years, how he loved my grandmother, and how for them, for me, that's a model of what I would like to see marriage. Or maybe I'd get Jen and Chuck Peters up here because they are the ones that mentor so many of our young couples as they're getting ready to get married. But today, that's not the kind of conversation when it comes to marriage that I want to have. Today I want to talk about what marriage in the church, what that symbolizes and how it relates to us in the context of actually just living out our faith. You see, regardless of our current personal relationship status, God uses the imagery of marriage throughout the New Testament. He uses that imagery to describe the church and its relationship to God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to himself as the bridegroom and to the church as the bride. The church, it's not buildings, the church is his people. And so as a result, Paul himself was single. He was a champion for singleness. He encouraged it. He thought it was a great way to live, and it helped you be able to focus on your faith. But as a result of it, even Paul used that same imagery to describe the church. When he would write to churches and congregations in different towns, he would talk about their relationship with God and sacrifice and so many of those things in the context of marriage, because that was a way that he could do that. So he used it. Most of the time, he used it to describe unity and what that looked like for the church. Because through Jesus Christ, we are united together. Individuals become family in the marriage, and in our decision to follow Christ, we become adopted. We become part of the family of God. And so we're united. We become united in our purpose, in our roles, and in our relationships. So I want to go back 12 years. This is what to my wedding day. Now you're going to notice a couple things. The facial hair is less. The hair on top of the head is more. Okay, those are the two, over 12 years, that's the result of working with Pastor Craig. But 12 years ago, I got married. This was Kim and I on our wedding day. When we got married, we were united. We stood in front of the church. We stood in front of a couple hundred guests, mostly people, a lot of people that were at the church that I was serving at the time, our family, some friends, and then some people that just randomly showed up, I think, too. But it didn't take long for Kim and I to discover that a marriage is not just what the pastor says, and it's not just that piece of paper that says you are now legally obligated to each other, okay? That's that one. She's basically saying, I now own you. But what we discovered is that we had a lot to learn about unity. Standing in front of the church and saying those words doesn't mean that when you go home and the first person doesn't remember to make the bed that you're not going to understand how that works or how to communicate about that. So for starters, Kim and I, we both had some different ideas about how to communicate to each other, particularly in the directions that we would go. And this came to a head almost immediately in our marriage. See, about 4 days in to our marriage, we were on our honeymoon, and we're in Playa del Carmen, and we decided to rent scooters. I didn't have a picture of us on the scooter, but I do have a picture of my hair messed up from the helmet and Kim holding one. And we were staying at this all-inclusive resort, but instead we said, let's go explore Playa. Let's see what there is in town. Somebody had said there's some cool shopping, there's some other stuff. And so we took a taxi into town, or whatever a taxi looked like. We think it was a taxi. Some guy gave us a ride. And we got to town, they dropped us off, and we rented scooters for the day. And we each got our own. And it wasn't very long into it that we're at a stoplight. Now, if you've ever driven in Mexico, what you realize, and you have to just become a part of it, is that sometimes you turn left from the right lane. Okay, and in our case, we needed to go left, and we were in the right lane, and so I was like trying to turn around, and Kim was behind me instead of next to me, and I turned and I said, hey, we need to go that way. And she said, okay.